Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, based on where you're joining us from in the world today. We truly appreciate your presence and hope to give you a valuable use of your time for today's presentation entitled How to Stay Ethical in an Unethical Climate, presented by Dr. Paul Melendez of the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona, of course, in collaboration with Ivy Exec. My name is Nia Tubenciential. I'm the Senior Content Manager here at Ivy Exec, and I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a couple of very brief housekeeping items for the audience. Number one, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage your participation, and you have the ability to ask questions using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel located on either left or right-hand side of your screen. In addition, we are recording today's session, and so you will receive an email with a link to a replay of the session via email in a few business days. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Paul Melendez. Dr. Melendez is Professor of Practice in the Department of Management and Organizations and founder for the Center of Leadership Ethics in the Eller College of Management at University of Arizona. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in business ethics, international management, organizational behavior, human resources, and innovation. He writes a variety of cases on personal and professional ethics, leads academic programs to emerging economies, and consults for clients around the world on ethical decision-making, transformational leadership, and innovation. He was previously on the faculty of University of Arizona's School of Public Administration and Policy, where he taught on public policy, public management, and the analysis of data for decision-making. So in short, you are in excellent hands, and it's my great pleasure to turn over to Dr. Melendez for the remainder of the presentation.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I thought before I went over this morning's overview of the session, I should share with you an interesting experience, which is a perfect salvo for today's session. I had a student that I bumped into in the elevator who wanted to talk a little bit about an exam that we had last week, and the student began to talk about how they had missed the exam and began to get into a very detailed explanation. Of course, the more detail I got, the more concern and questions I had, and it reminded me of a very famous professor at the University of Virginia by the name of Professor Bach. He had two excellent students that had decided to go on a long weekend and enjoy themselves. They knew they had an exam on Monday, and after a very long weekend of partying, they decided to sleep a little bit longer, miss the exam, and go visit the professor after the exam. When they went to the professor's office, they explained, we have an A in the class. Surely you know that this was a big mistake. We had a flat tire on our drive down, and of course, we didn't have a spare. So the professor said, no problem. You can come back tomorrow and do a makeup. Both students were elated and also studied the entire night. When they came in the next morning, the professor put them in two different rooms. He was very well known for having these exams that were for 100 points, but oftentimes with just a few questions. One of the students turned the exam over, basic question on anatomy. Turned the page over for 95 points. The question was, which tire? So one of the things that you always want to do, and I always tell this to students, is be sure to tell the truth. As Mark Twain said, it's always easier to remember what you said later. So for today, here's my overview. I'd like to talk a little bit about my Center for Leadership Ethics. I want to talk a little bit about breaches of trust in society. Some root causes for unethical behavior, share with you what I like to call a textbook case on trust, share with you my ethical decision-making model, walk you through a few different cases that I've written that illustrate the model, and then wrap it up with a few takeaways. Our Center for Leadership Ethics is really exceptional and is very well known internationally. We do a lot of research, we do a lot of teaching, and we do a lot of outreach programs. Those three essential legs of the center really distinguish us from many other centers that you find in business schools here in North America. So I'd like to start out with a little ethics quiz. Simple, true, false, multiple choice question, and we're going to see how well you do from the very get-go. So here's our first question. True or false? Aristotle was an understudy of Plato. Give you a moment. You have a 50-50 chance.
You can put in your answers via the chat box.
And the answer is true. Aristotle was one of Plato's most promising students. After Plato had passed and Aristotle was not the heir apparent, he would end up leaving, he would end up traveling, he would end up tutoring this person of great historical significance, Alexander the Great, and would eventually open his own academy called the Lyceum. So it'll be interesting to see how you did with the first of a few ethics questions throughout the course of this afternoon session. So I'd like to start out by talking about breaches of trust in society. This is some recent data from Edelman. And what I really find interesting about this most recent data set is that if you look across this slide, you see that there has been a precipitous drop in trust in a number of different sectors, NGOs, business, government, and media. And for those of you that might be wondering what is the difference between the general population and informed public, the informed public is the one I tend to focus a little bit more on. This generally is an age group of 25 to 65. These are college graduates. These are people that are in the top quartile of their household income, and they're big consumers of media. So if you look at NGOs, business and government and the media, you see double-digit drops across the board. So of course, this kind of raises the question, why? And as I think a little bit about some of the more recent scandals that have occurred in each of these areas, I think I can make a pretty good case for why we've seen this drop. So I'll start out first with Oxfam. Many of you may be familiar with Oxfam. It's an international organization that is focused on trying to alleviate poverty. One of the big scandals that beset the organization involved Haiti just a few years ago following the earthquake. And some of the senior management there on the ground taking advantage of a rather vulnerable population and bringing in prostitutes. And what was a problem in Haiti turned out to be kind of symptomatic of other problems the organization had faced in other parts of the world. You know, this is a huge breach of trust, in this case with an NGO, and had very significant impact. You know, when you consider that Oxfam is funded by the government in London, in Oxford, I should say, this really posed a very serious threat to the organization's funding source. So this is just one of what I would consider to be a number of examples. Here's another, Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had a well-known mantra that was pushed by its CEO, 8 is great. The idea was that in their retail sales strategy, people in the banks were supposed to try to get 8 of the products into the hands of their customers. These ambitious goals led many employees to cut corners. And as I'm sure we all remember having read in the newspapers or seen on TV, you had a number of associates who were opening up unauthorized bank accounts, checking accounts, and of course collecting fees as a result. And then it just didn't stop. You know, more recently, we've also heard about the bank facing some real serious questions concerning having people that have taken out auto loans and them being extended additional coverage, or people who had secured mortgages with interest rates having to pay additional fees to retain rates that they thought they had locked into. You know, in this case, for a business, a commercial bank, a huge breach of trust. I'm sure a number of us have followed in the government sector the scandals that affected the EPA. Mr. Pruitt, who finally left the office, you know, left amid quite a few ethical concerns and allegations. If you think back, it was an interesting range of different allegations that Mr. Pruitt faced. One of them include, of course, the inappropriate use of taxpayer funds, the infamous $45,000 phone booth that he insisted on having. There were also questions about Mr. Pruitt having a rather nice apartment in the DC area at a very, very below rate, which happened to belong to a wife of an energy executive that, of course, if you think a little bit about conflicts of interest, could pose problems for Mr. Pruitt. And then, of course, we had also the concerns with him picking up the phone and contacting one of the executives with Chick-fil-A because he had an interest in perhaps having his wife start up a franchise. Again, whether it's with an NGO like Oxfam, a business like Wells Fargo, or a government sector, or the government like the EPA, all of these kind of smack of breaches of trust. And finally, we have Facebook, which is one of the epitomes of a media giant. Just a few years ago, you might recall, there was a software engineer that had installed a personality app on the Facebook page. And that access right there probably resulted in about 250,000 people downloading the app. Now, unbeknownst to them, the software engineer also on the back end gained access to their friends. And taking that data that was stored on a private server, ended up handing that over to an organization which we all remember, Cambridge Analytica, which then created profiles for some 30 million people just a few years ago. So whether you're talking about a breach of trust with an NGO, a business, a government, or a media company, if you think a little bit about those precipitous drops in all those sectors, it's more than justified. Now we're ready for another ethics quiz question. Here we go. True or false? In 1909, under the Pure Food and Drug Act, there was an attempt to outlaw Coca-Cola because cocaine was an active ingredient.
The poll is up. We'll leave it open for about another 15 seconds. About 5 more seconds. All right, and closing the poll. So, Dr. Melendez, we have a total of 81% reporting true and 19% reporting false.
Some of you are saying, I do not want to take his class. These true-false questions are proving a little tricky. In 1909, the Pure Food and Drug Act really addressed Coca-Cola, not on cocaine, but on caffeine. The company had a few years before pulled that ingredient from the product, but the company was then being scrutinized because of just the sheer amounts of caffeine that they were putting in their soft drink. So this is, you'd have to be a really good student of history or probably having worked with Coca-Cola, but I thought you'd all appreciate a question involving Coke. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the root causes of unethical behavior. This is really, to me, a gift that forensic auditing has given us. Forensic auditors have said for a number of years that every financial crime invariably involves 3 components. You have motivation, you have opportunity, and you have rationalization. And I've seen this play out both in the classroom and in the corporate world. You know, for students, whether they're undergrads, grads, or PhD students, there's a motivation to earn good grades. You know, that motivation in and of itself isn't bad. Students have opportunities at all levels to cut corners, you know, to cheat, if you will. Opportunity isn't bad in and of itself. It's, the way I see it, is the door that kind of meets the motivation. When you have a combination of motivation and opportunity, and they begin to converge upon each other, you begin to hear people rationalize behaviors or actions that I believe they know deep down inside are probably inappropriate, but still they're trying to allay themselves that perhaps what they're doing isn't so bad. So whenever you hear anybody say something like, everybody else is doing it, it's not hurting anyone, the whole scenario is unfair, what you're typically hearing is somebody that is trying to rationalize their behavior, and that is certainly something that I've heard from students that have been involved with academic integrity violations. So what we see in the classroom we also see in the corporate world. And I wanted to share with you a rather interesting example. Some of you may have recalled a scandal a few years ago involving HealthSouth. The company is still around. I had the good fortune of not only interviewing, but having the CFO of the company come in and give a talk. And in this interview that I did with Mr. Beam, and you can see the jacket cover of his text here, I talked to him about these three factors, given the fact that he was a CFO. And I asked him, I said, what was the motivation behind some of your activities? You know, Mr. Beam eventually was found guilty and was sentenced and has been barred from the financial sector. His motivation, he said, was quite honestly to make quarterly earnings. You know, this is something that you hear quite often, right? There's a lot of pressure for companies, whether they're public or private, to meet earnings. The opportunity for the CFO was really obvious. I thought there would be some exotic shell game, Enron style, but in this case, it was rather simple. You know, he found a way to accelerate the recognition of revenues and kind of defer the payment of liabilities and payments. And so it was really a very, very simple structure that he had put in place. When I asked him about his rationalization, he did say that there were many other CFOs at that particular time that were engaging in the same types of shenanigans. But his other rationalization was that he felt it would be very difficult to make some of the really tough financial decisions, perhaps lay off employees that he had known for many years that had been working very, very hard. So what you see, or what I see in the classroom, is oftentimes also carried over into the corporate world. So whenever there is an ethical scandal, one of the things that I've always found useful or have encouraged people to do is to look at those three root causes, because when you use these three perspectives, you glean some very interesting insights. So we've talked about a lot of examples in the marketplace of breaches of trust. I thought it would be important also to talk about a positive example of an executive that got it right. And what this makes me think about is this little model that I have here, which is that trust ultimately has three drivers. When leaders demonstrate accountability, and what I mean by accountability is this sense of responsibility, the sense that the buck stops with the person at the very top of the organization. Another aspect or driver of trust is that executive's ability to come up with very creative solutions. You know, when everyone's watching, when time is a real critical factor. This ability to look at the situation and come up with some really unique approaches to solving problems. And then, of course, executives, even as they've taken responsibility for what's occurred and they've rolled out some potential solutions to a very tough situation, they have to have the courage to act. And I've seen instances where you may have one or two of these missing and you get very, very different outcomes. So what I would like to do here is kind of take you back in history to, for me, what was one of the more compelling examples of a CEO facing a crisis that got it right. This is the former CEO of Johnson & Johnson, James Burke, and I'd like to kind of walk you through how he navigated the rather difficult time period in the early 1980s when a handful of people died after ingesting Tylenol in the early 1980s in Chicago. The CEO took ultimate accountability. It would have been really easy for the CEO to cast blame on McNeil Labs, who had actually produced the product. It would have also been easy for the CEO to assign some blame to the retail outlet, because what the public didn't know, but what the CEO had known for some time, was that somebody had actually gone into the retail outlet, taken the product off the shelf, actually opened up the contents of the Tylenol and put cyanide in it, and then walked back into the store and put it back on the shelf. You know, there were many opportunities for the CEO to point the finger, if you will, to both McNeil and the retail outlet. He didn't. He took full responsibility. He said, it's one of our products. It is ultimately our responsibility. And that particular product line, before the scandal, had about 37% of the market before the scandal. Immediately after, it dropped to 7. So this was not only a big threat to the business itself, Tylenol, but this was one of the more profitable parts of the business for Johnson & Johnson as a parent company. So what did the CEO do? In a rather short amount of time, he had the company develop the first triple safety sealed package. This was before the FDA had required it. It was really kind of a groundbreaking innovation. He also made the decision to move away from capsules and move towards caplets and instituted one of the first 1-800 numbers. All of these innovations were done in a very short span of time when everyone was watching. Courage? Well, the CEO went on 60 Minutes. This was not something that was necessarily supported by his board of directors, but he wanted to get in front of the TV, he wanted to get in front of the audience and make it very clear that the company was responsible for this. They were coming up with solutions, and he, in the most sincerest terms, asked the public to give Tylenol and Johnson & Johnson a second chance. He also instituted the first nationwide recall, which was not a minor decision, given that this involved over 31 million bottles, and at the time was about a $100 million decision. In the end, the CEO and the company was able to weather the storm. They were able to regain that market share, in fact, even exceed 37%. And as we all know, Johnson & Johnson has grown as a company, not only providing pharmaceuticals, but also medical equipment and other consumer products. Now we have another ethics quiz question. True or false? The co-founder of Warner Brothers was found of profiting from trading in his own company stock.
The poll is open, and we'll give you all about 20 to 30 seconds to respond. All right, we've got another 5 seconds. All right, and closing the poll now.
Okay, let's see how you did.
All right, we have, 82% saying true and 18% saying false.
Excellent. Our participants took ground back. I think that was the opposite of what we had in the previous true-false question. This is true. If you think back to the Roaring '20s and some of the high valuations of companies and typically back then associated with TV and radio in the 1990s with the bull market and the internet and technology companies, there's a lot of parallels. In this particular case, one of the co-founders, Harry Warner, was in fact to be engaging in insider trading. It's important to note that back then the SEC did not have any type of regulations or laws that would have precluded this. And it wasn't just Warner Brothers, it was also RCA and the Samhoff family that was engaging in the same types of behaviors. So, well done. I'd like to spend a few moments now sharing with you an ethical decision-making model that I put together a number of years ago. My approach to ethics is to really look at how people go about making decisions. And the argument I've made for a number of years is that, we make decisions based on what we think and feel. And that's rather normal, but how we think and feel is very subjective. So from an executive standpoint, one of the things I've tried to really advocate is more of an objective set of criterion that you want to use when you're faced with an ethical dilemma. So for me, there are essentially 4 components, and I'll walk you through each of these, and most importantly, I'll illustrate how this model works with real cases that we're all familiar with. The first step in my model is to kind of identify all the stakeholders, and a lot of times I will have some of my students, undergrads and grads, ask me if what I really mean are shareholders, and I always point out that shareholders are one of many stakeholders, right? There's primary and secondary stakeholders. And, in the end, everybody is a stakeholder, right? And what I'm really trying to get people to think about is how can a particular situation or a decision or an outcome either benefit or burden different stakeholders. And I've had a few very bright students point out, if everyone's a potential stakeholder, wouldn't that mean you'd have to consider everyone's interests? And I always smile because That's actually at the heart of ethics, right? You want to consider multiple interests in a particular situation. So the first step, and what can be a very beneficial step, is just to simply acknowledge who is it that could be benefited or burdened by a particular situation or outcome. The next step is you want to review the financial implications. We've seen businesses time and time again have to make decisions, but how do you balance short versus long term? One of the examples that we are probably very familiar with, if you think back in history, was the situation with Ford Pinto and the exploding rear gas tank. The company had done a very robust benefit cost analysis. They knew there was a problem. They knew what it would cost to fix the problem, which was, I think, back then somewhere around $11 or $10. And they also knew what could happen in terms of injuries and deaths. And they made a decision that it might be more financially beneficial to proceed without doing the retrofit. So we've seen businesses make these types of decisions before, in my opinion, almost to the exclusion of some of the other considerations or elements of the model that I have. You also want to consider the law. You want to consider existing laws, pending litigation or regulations that could impact the business. The challenge with relying solely on the law is that the law doesn't speak to every business situation or scenario that can occur. In fact, I would even argue that the law tends to lag in terms of societal norms. So at best, it may be reactionary, and even when we do have laws, they don't necessarily specifically address every particular business situation that executives might face. Nonetheless, it's important to consider the law. Finally, you want to apply ethical thought. And since we only have a limited amount of time for for today's webinar, I'm going to really kind of boil this down to two very different divergent schools of thought. One is what I like to call the results-based approach, and the other the means-based approach. And anytime you've heard people or you have found yourself saying the ends justify the means, you're probably espousing a results-based approach. Others that say, well, it's the means that justify the ends, it's more of a means-based approach. There's a really interesting dilemma that I think illustrates these two very different schools of thought, and some of you may be familiar with the trolley and the footbridge problem. For those of you that are not, here's how it works. You have a runaway trolley, and you have a person that sees that if that trolley just continues down the track, 5 people will die. However, he's got a switch, and if he pulls that switch, he can redirect the trolley onto another track where only 1 person will die. Now, typical results-based approach thinking would say it's really not much of a choice, right? If you can save 5 people, at the expense of 1, it's justified. Well, it's interesting because we've also looked at that thinking along the lines of what is referred to as the footbridge problem. Same scenario, you have a runaway trolley. In this case, a person has standing in front of them a rather large person. If they push that person over the bridge, he will die. However, 5 will be saved. We've had researchers look at this in different ways. Some people would say, well, no, I couldn't do that. That would be the equivalent to murder, right? But they're the same people that in the previous scenario probably would have said, yeah, I'd pull the switch. And so the question really is, what's the difference? Well, with the wonders of functional MRIs and looking at our brains when we're confronted with these dilemmas, you find that different parts of the brain are actually getting access. But in any event, when you look at whether it's the trolley or the footbridge dilemma, what you find are 2 very different schools of thought that can justify actions in one case and perhaps not in another. So here's an interesting spectrum that I think for me has been really valuable. On one end of the spectrum, when there are situations that are clearly illegal, not much of a discussion. On the other end of the spectrum, when you have situations that are ethical and legal, we like those situations. But what do you do when you have situations when something is legal, but there are questions as to whether or not they're ethical? The red line to me is also important because when we have these large scandals, scandals which can be in NGOs, businesses, government, or even the media, when you think back to the examples that we went through earlier, I don't think people woke up on one particular day and decided to engage in illegal or unethical behavior. I think what is a bigger discussion is the culture that those organizations have. And over time, if a caustic culture is allowed to take root, that line can begin to move slowly, almost at a glacial pace, excuse me, but will invariably affect the decision making of everybody within the organization. And in part, this helps to explain how we can have these large events, these large scandals that involve a multitude of people at different levels spread out in different parts of the world. So let's try this model out, looking at a few different examples after we do our next ethics quiz question. So here's our next question. Who signed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act into law? Was it A, Gerald Ford, B, Jimmy Carter, or C, Ronald Reagan?
The poll is open, and it's my ethical responsibility to own up to the typo there for Jimmy Carter. I missed the Y, finger slip. Leave it open for another 5 seconds. And closing the poll. And here are the results. 20% says Gerald Ford, 43% says Jimmy Carter, and 37% say Ronald Reagan.
It was Jimmy Carter. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to me, is fascinating. It has taken many different iterations. It is still very much something that affects businesses today for the better. What you might find interesting is that one of the main companies that really drove some of the push for the FCPA was Lockheed. Lockheed had experienced some financial difficulties during the 70s. Some of the government auditors had gone in and to kind of examine the books and had found some irregularities. And what they had discovered was that between 1950 and 1970, $22 million had essentially been used for bribing government officials in different parts of the world to try to facilitate business, or as some people have said, to grease the skids for some of the hardware, the F-104 Starfighter. And this was rampant, and this was something that had gone on for many decades. And there were many other companies, but if there was one particular company that was very much at the very center of this, it would have been Lockheed. And the CEO and the chairman would eventually leave the company. So I've got a couple of cases that I'd like to walk you through to illustrate the model and to leave you with a few questions.
Dr. Melendez, sorry to jump in. Your view hasn't returned to your slide presentation. If you'd kindly stop sharing your screen and start sharing again, it should get back to the presentation view. Just your screen, not your webcam. There we go.
Okay, very good. Should have had another poll question, but one of the questions I would ask is how many of you have a Facebook account? I have definitely shown my age when I've asked this question, because when I did it 10 years ago, it seemed that most people did. Now, depending on your generation, Facebook gets kind of kicked to the curb as, oh, that's what older people use. Nonetheless, Facebook as a form of social media has found its way into the workplace. So one of the things that I think is a really interesting question is, should employers use Facebook in the hiring process? Now, think about how this affects multitudes of stakeholders, right? Not just the employees and the employers. You think a little bit about who could be benefited or burdened by using social media in this way. What are the financial reasons that organizations would use Facebook? We just need to know. And looking at the participant list from yesterday, I know we have a few HR professionals that are in the audience today. It's very expensive to hire employees. You want to make sure that you get the decision right. So if social media can help in that end, you seriously consider using it. Is it legal? It is, so long as you don't make decisions that run afoul of affirmative action or EEOC. But the real question is it ethical? And this is a really, really interesting question, which to me, I like to always approach it from the potential of unconscious bias. So to illustrate this, I want to share with you an image. Let's assume that we had two finalists, and myself and another person making the hiring decision said, well, let's flip a coin. All things being equal, these would be two perfectly suitable employees. We've already tried to go to our HR manager and ask if we could hire both, and they've told us no. So I decide to say to my colleague, why don't we see what they have out on Facebook? And we see this picture. And if you look at this picture and you just give some very visceral responses, and I've done this before, you'll hear people say she's young, she's attractive, she's smart, there's some diversity, she looks very classy. These are all wonderful, wonderful things. The question is, what would happen if we didn't see that image and we saw this image? You typically don't get the same response. You get people who may pause, they may hesitate, they may say this person's religious, this person is oppressed. I've heard a lot of different things, but typically they're not as positive as seeing the first image. What this gets to is the unintended consequences of unconscious bias, which for me is one of the big things that I think you have to give thought to as an organization as to whether or not or how social media will be incorporated into the hiring process. Here's another example. Should a company engage in a corporate inversion to avoid paying taxes? You may recall from a few years ago, Pfizer was looking to acquire AstraZeneca. And it wasn't because AstraZeneca presented some reduced manufacturing costs or there was a new market. It was quite frankly because Pfizer saw this as an opportunity to set up a new PO in another country that had a lower corporate tax rate. You think about the stakeholders again, there's a multitude of employees, consumers, regulators that could be affected for better or worse by this type of decision. The financial drivers behind that decision, quite simply the US corporate tax rate. Combined, it's probably just under 40%. Is it legal? It is very legal, although there have been a lot of moves by different regulatory agencies and elected officials to try to stem the tide of companies who are engaging in corporate inversion. It's still a legal practice. Is it ethical? It's a really good question. There have been critics that have said, this is unpatriotic. Every time a US company sets up a PO in Ireland to go from a 40% to say a 10% corporate tax rate, that hurts the US Treasury, which underwrites a lot of the basic services that we provide. But you also have other people that have countered saying, look, the US is the only country among OECD countries that taxes its companies both in the business that it does here in the US and abroad. So the debate goes on and on. But as you can see, just like with the example with Facebook, looking at the stakeholders, the financial, legal, and ethical considerations are really important. Last but not least, one of the most recent cases I wrote involving AI, should a company manufacture AI-powered surveillance tools? The pace is out of the tube. If you think about AI and its applications, sure, we've all heard about the self-driving cars, the navigation apps, but we also have some new products coming online involving facial recognition. The impacts, again, from a stakeholder standpoint, cut across the board. PwC did a recent study and found that by the year 2030, AI is probably going to have a global impact just under $16 billion. Just to put that into perspective, that's more than the combined economies of China and India. From a legal standpoint, there are some agencies, there are some laws, but again, it's very unregulated. It's very much, as some experts have dubbed, kind of a Wild West, if you will. From an ethical standpoint, I think there are a lot of questions that we should be asking, not the least of which is, can deep learning machines be taught ethics? What type of ethics? If you think a little bit about the example I offered earlier concerning the trolley and the footbridge dilemma, that would be an interesting thought now, right? When you think a little bit about public transit and you think of trains that are being controlled autonomously, right, with AI. How do you teach, a trolley to make those decisions? So this leaves us with, as I oftentimes find, more questions than answers, but that process of looking at situations, asking the question, who are the stakeholders? What are the financial, legal, and ethical considerations? I think when you take all of those considerations in balance, my argument has been that you will be making a much better decision, a more informed decision, because you will have included more critical components than typically people will use. One more question for our ethics quiz. Which CEO was involved in an insider trading scandal involving Erbitux? A, Dennis Kozlowski, B, Sam Waxel, or C, Bernie Ebbers?
All right, we'll leave the poll open for another 15 seconds. Five more seconds. All right, and closing it out. And here are the results. 22% say Dennis Kozlowski, 35% say Sam Waxel, and 43% say Bernie Ebbers.
Sam Waxel it is. Very few people know about M-clone or Erbitux. Erbitux, by the way, is a treatment for colon cancer. But what people do know, and what really kind of pulls up memories, was Martha Stewart's involvement in this entire scandal. Sam Waxel, who was the founder and CEO, got news that the product did not make the FDA's clinical trials, and we talked about insider trading, acted on that information, sold his positions. He had some family and friends that followed suit, one of which was Martha Stewart. Of course, we know that Martha denied this and went to prison, and only in America, you see her assets drop, and once she comes out of prison, those assets probably reach some stratospheric levels. The irony with this whole case was that had Sam Waxel just kind of weathered the news, a few years later, the FDA would approve those clinical trials, and the product would actually get into the marketplace as a cancer-arresting pharmaceutical. In conclusion, a couple of takeaways before we go into a Q&A session. You might have noticed that with each of the three cases that I shared with you, involving Facebook, corporate inversion, and artificial intelligence, I put everything in the context of a question. The reason I do that is because as a leader, if you really want to engage people at all levels, both internal and external, instead of making statements, put in the form of question. You are more likely to get people's perspective, different perspectives, and I think that's really rich for discourse. So I think putting an ethical dilemma in the form of a question invites people to help you gain perspective. Look, whether you use a model like I've suggested with the stakeholders, financial, legal, or ethical criterion, I think that increasingly using some framework, a model for decision making, is really important, because while we make decisions every day, thousands of decisions based on what we think and feel, those are very subjective. And as I've tried to point out here, if you've got an objective set of criterion, you're going to have a much better time, I think a much easier time trying to get consensus among other individuals to help make decisions. And for me, I think from a leadership standpoint, you always want to try to emphasize the what and the why. When I talked about the Wells Fargo example earlier, it was really clear that the company had this mantra, as eight is great, that consumers were going to be encouraged to purchase a number or be pulled into a number of the different products and services that the bank offered. So the goals were really clear, right? Here's what employees had to do. It would have been really helpful if that same leadership would have also said, but here's why it's important for you to do it the right way. Not cutting corners, making sure that we don't lose trust in the marketplace, making sure that achieving those targets were done appropriately is the most important thing that matters. That probably or could have very largely affected the outcome for the company or any organization for that matter. So as leaders, you always want to emphasize the what, but you also want to follow it up with a why, and I think that kind of helps provide the guardrails it's an opportunity to reinstate values and the ways that organizations get things done properly. It's a really good opportunity. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time this morning, this afternoon, and now I'd like to open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Melendez. That was a really engaging presentation, and gives a lot of food for thought for me, certainly, and for all of those who are attending who are in leadership positions, for sure. Going back to the last case that you shared relating to AI, I was wondering what AI application scares you the most presently?
Well, actually, the reason behind the case and the reason why this has been a real focal point for me is because um, in law enforcement, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking local, state, or federal, law enforcement agents have increasingly been using body cameras. And those body cameras in and of themselves are controversial. But now there are companies that have really groundbreaking technologies that are essentially allowing them to fit body cameras with AI. And the reason why this to me is a real game changer is because if I'm an officer and I'm on my beat and I've got my body cam on, it is taking in through facial recognition everyone who comes across the lens. The University of Georgetown recently put a study out that about half of the US population now is up in the cloud and has been picked up through facial recognition. The reason why this is important is because now this will allow in the future a police officer to get pinged, because if an officer sees that a particular person and it's run through the cloud has a felony, I can be notified instantly and I can make a determination as to whether or not I'm going to move forward. Now, the reason why I think this is a real game changer is because the accuracy of facial recognition is less than perfect. If you're a Caucasian, it's got a really high percentage. You hear anywhere from 95 to 99%. But if you're a person with an olive complexion or an African American female, those accuracy percentages drop significantly. In fact, for African American women, it's down in the 35% range. So to me, I can see the benefits, right? The good that could come as a result of AI. But in the same token, you can see how the technology can present some real challenges, and these are challenges for, in my opinion, parts of our society that have already faced challenges with law enforcement. So when I talk to police chiefs or law enforcement agencies or leaders, and not just with the local police department, but if you think about applications here also with federal law enforcement, with ICE, you got to really balance this out. And I think that there's a lot of potential benefit, but there could also be some potential harm.
Thank you so much. This next question comes from William, and William would like to know, is it ethical to withhold information that might have negative impact if the information is the result of slander that has not yet been proven?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Is it ethical to withhold information that might have a negative impact if the information is a result of slander that has not yet been proven?
Well, it sounds like there's a real specific situation or scenario that's kind of on the back end there. Look, I think as a leader, one of the things that you have responsibility to do is gathering information, or what we might call fact finding. And I think that first step is really critical, because a lot of times I notice that people may jump to the conclusion that you have an ethical dilemma, when in fact with just doing a little bit of kind of fact finding, you may find that that's not the case. But I think one of the first steps you have to do is you have to gather information. You got to get a baseline. You got to be responsible with that information. Depending on the company, depending on its reach, its scope, you want to be forthcoming. Of course, if you have information that could pose any kind of safety risk or anything like that to consumers, but you also need to make sure that the information that you're working with is reliable. And so in that case, you have to go to great lengths to make sure that you're being responsible with approaching the validity of that information and using not just your internal assets that you have within the organization. This is where trust becomes really important. Having a network and people that you can also go outside to that can be trusted to give you an added perspective. So it's a tough question, but I would approach it from the standpoint of good decision making starts with verifying facts. And once you verify those facts, then you go to the next step in
All
terms of
right.
disclosures.
Thank you. This next question comes from Nikki. Nikki would like to know whether you believe that unethical corporate behavior has impacted the labor market, specifically job seekers.
Very good question. I do. If any of you, and I'm sure a number of you, have looked at employment rates, if you pay close attention to the labor market, I think right now, any company that is associated with a question concerning their ethics or have been involved in scandals, depending on what the labor market's like. I mean, if you have a tight labor market, that might be a very important consideration. And the other thing that I think is also important, so the answer would be yes, but I think the other answer is we also have to be very mindful of the different generations that are in the workplace. I've noticed that in my teaching of a business ethics course here on campus, the younger generations, not just the millennials, but even the newer generations, they have had a steady diet of ethical scandals. They only know ethics in terms of when leaders have gotten it wrong. So I have become much more mindful of also looking at positive ethical leadership models and examples of CEOs and executives that have gotten it right. I don't think there's any question that, if a company has been involved in an ethics scandal, it hurts the reputation. And for people that have choices, for people in a labor market that have multiple offers, I mean, that can be a deciding factor. And I think it should be, right? Because that commitment is being made on both ends. And so I do think, in fact, that it can have an impact.
Remaining in that same vein related to hiring and the labor market, Nancy has a question regarding hiring practices, specifically around ageism. Nancy notes that social media, as well as required inputs on a website, such as an HR application system that require graduation dates and so on, enable the current crisis of ageism. She'd like to understand what can be done to create a credential-based hiring practice versus salary, cost, age, and so on.
Great question. I think it would be interesting for not only the person that asked the question, but for anyone who's in HR. AI has also crept into the space, and AI actually has been looked to as perhaps one of the great saviors, if you will, to try to help combat some of the inherent bias that we find in decision making. There is a product out, and actually I shared this with students this past semester, called HireView. And it is essentially an AI-powered tool. You log into your computer. It's almost like a Skype exchange. And what a lot of people don't know is that on the back end is AI. And what that bot is doing is essentially monitoring your speech, looking at your responses, your idiosyncrasies. One of the advantages that some people have argued is that, using a system like that, AI-powered interview tools, can help root out some of those very biases that the participant raised. Look, I am of the opinion that one of the areas that really is a good candidate for some innovation and for a new way of approaching the whole process of attracting, selecting, training, hiring, and retaining employees is the HR function. And I believe, in my experience, that the more diverse workforces, the better the organizations. And I think that it's the HR leaders that get this and get the support and the buy-in from others within the organization that really have a competitive advantage.
Great. This next question comes from Emil, and Emil would like to understand what impacts or affects whether a corporation encourages the rise of ethical versus unethical people to leadership positions?
I think the short answer would be culture. I think that in and of itself is to me one of the greatest I think answers to that question. You know, when you reflect on some of the examples that we went through earlier, and again, those are just a few examples. We could bring in just scores of others. That corporate culture, the tone that gets set from the top, is so important. It really is the leader's opportunity to make very clear, right, what the company is going to do, but the importance of why they're doing it. What's appropriate behavior? What's inappropriate behavior? Leaders, and I don't know if you noticed on my very last slide in the takeaways, and maybe we can pull that up. I put that very deliberately, and it in some ways kind of addresses the question. Leaders cast shadows, and I really believe that in organizational life, leaders have opportunities every day to make decisions, and many times they may not be aware of it, but there are other people that are watching very carefully. We all know that sometimes the decision not to make a decision can speak even louder than decisions that are made. But I think leaders cast shadows, and that's a very powerful way of looking at leadership. And I think that ultimately leaders have to set that tone from the top for what's appropriate, what's inappropriate behavior. They have to act using good information, fact-based information. But the other thing that I think is also really critical that gets lost sometimes is the impact that mid-level managers have in the organization. That is probably where some of the greatest impacts, for better or worse, can be made. Because if you think about large organizations, and again, it doesn't matter if you're public or private, you think about your day-to-day operations. If you think about your day-to-day operations and who you engage with, it may not be the CEO or people from the C-suite. So the next closest would be those direct supervisors. What we have known for years is that the same things that apply to leaders has to cascade down throughout the organization. So those mid-level managers are really critical because those are the people that are going to have the day-to-day contact with frontline employees. And the same rules apply, right? How they align the messages from the top of the organization to the mid and lower levels of the organization, how they model behaviors, how they are mindful of how they cast shadows, I think is really, really critical. That all gets to culture.
All right, great. We'll just do two final questions. This next question comes from, where did it go? From Chris. Chris is noticing that it's widely known that competitors sometimes use fake reviews on each other's websites. Let's say, for example, Amazon. How does one go about combating unethical behavior in other companies without engaging in unethical behavior themselves?
Wow, really timely question. I don't know if I have the perfect answer, but I will tell you that when you think about my presentation earlier, and I talk about the breaches of trust in different sectors, I mentioned NGOs. I have to tell you that third parties can be significant in terms of trying to establish greater transparency and trust. Having a third party, whether an NGO I use as an example because NGOs, if you look at their impact and the traction that they gained in society, goes back to just a few decades ago when large companies were really beginning to outsource a significant amount of their labor, whether it's offshoring or outsourcing. And there were concerns about their standards, in other countries, and that maybe they were cutting corners. No matter what those companies did in terms of audits and trying to provide assurances that they were doing production or manufacturing in a way that would be consistent with how they would do it here stateside, people didn't trust those companies. So what was the difference? Bringing in NGOs, bringing in third parties that were able to come in and do independent assessments. That really kind of bolstered the credibility of not just NGOs, but companies. I think in a similar fashion, you need to have a third party. You need to have somebody that's independent. And you need to have somebody that can provide a perspective that in the marketplace will be trusted. And let's be very honest here. I mean, I think trust is something right now that has always been precious, but is short in many regards in different areas. So I think third parties may have a huge opportunity to try to kind of ameliorate that.
All right, great. Thank you. And finally, this is coming from Muriel. Is there any difference between an ethical scandal that occurs in business versus government or versus nonprofit?
Yeah. So people are people, whether you're in a business, government, or nonprofit. I think the pressures that people face in those sectors is very different. In the business sector, if you have a scandal, there is that ultimate potential price that consumers can choose to take their business elsewhere, and the damage that can occur to the organization can be really, really felt by shareholders. So that has a different impact. In the government sector, you think about public officials, and you think about the loss of trust when we have a scandal. People, I think, have a little more recourse because in the end, if it is a government official, you think about our democratic process, we can actually get a recall, right? We can actually move to have people removed from office. So when there is a breach of trust, it is different from the business sector, but I think the recourse that people have is a little bit different. I mean, and if you look at nonprofits, right, that are essentially providing services for different stakeholders that maybe the government can't do or the business is not found profitable, when you have scandals in the nonprofit sector, a total different consequence. If you give from a charitable standpoint, it's a choice. And so if a nonprofit like Oxfam is involved in some type of scandal, people can decide to earmark those donations to other organizations. So that implies a different set of pressures. So when I look at the nonprofits, the government, and the business sectors, people are always involved. The pressures, though, and the consequences can play out very, very, very differently. In the end, they're all breaches of trust, shareholder, public, communal, but they have different consequences.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Melendez. This has truly been a great presentation, really thoughtful answers during the Q&A. Thank you to all the attendees who hung out with us thus far, and I hope you are richer for it in your ethical practices and chops and having a decision-making process. So we would ask you to look out for more collaboration in the future between IB Exec and Eller. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Melendez for any final words.
No, I'd just like to say thank you. I hope that you found this time to be engaging. Oftentimes, I like to leave people with the question that I leave you with more questions, and I hope I did. If anyone has any questions or would like to continue the dialogue, my contact information will be made available, and I'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you for your time this morning and this afternoon.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Take care and see you soon.